Abu Abbas leaned back in his seat aboard EgyptAir Flight 348 and believed he had won. The man who had masterminded the hijacking of the cruise ship Achille Lauro, who had ordered the murder of a 69-year-old wheelchair-bound American named Leon Klinghoffer and had his body thrown overboard into the Mediterranean, was now flying at 25,000 feet under Egyptian diplomatic protection, bound for Tunisia. The deal was done. President Mubarak had personally negotiated safe passage for Abbas and his 3 Palestine Liberation Front gunmen in exchange for their surrender of the ship. By every calculation Abbas could make from that business-class seat on the night of October 10, 1985, he was untouchable. So why did the cabin lights flicker as the Boeing 737 suddenly banked hard to the left? What Abbas didn't know, what nobody aboard that aircraft knew, was that 4 United States Navy F-14 Tomcats from the carrier USS Saratoga had been stalking them through the darkness for the better part of an hour. The Intercept had been ordered directly by the White House. President Reagan, furious that Egypt was about to let the murderers of an American citizen simply fly away to freedom, had authorized one of the most audacious operations in Cold War-era military history. No bombing run, no shoot-down, something far more surgical. American fighters were going to force a sovereign nation's commercial airliner to land at a base of their choosing, pull the terrorists off the plane, and put them in handcuffs. No weapons release, no casualties. The whole thing had to work on intimidation, precision flying, and the sheer psychological weight of Tomcats materializing out of nowhere in the middle of the night. If you've never heard this story told from the cockpit, subscribe and drop a like so more of these operations get the full breakdown. And if you know someone who served aboard the Saratoga during this deployment, tell them to find us in the comments. The operational window was impossibly tight. American intelligence had identified the specific EgyptAir flight only hours earlier. The Tomcat crews received their orders, launched from the Saratoga's deck in the central Mediterranean, and had to locate one 737 among all the commercial traffic crossing North Africa at night. No data link existed to track the target in real time. All they carried was their own radar, a set of radio frequencies to monitor, and a rough vector provided by national-level intelligence assets whose involvement remains partially classified to this day. Abbas was sipping tea. The Tomcats were already in position. 4 gunmen. That's all it took. 4 members of the Palestine Liberation Front, armed with Kalashnikovs and grenades, seized control of a cruise liner, carrying more than 400 passengers and crew on October 7, 1985. The Achille Lauro was a 23,000-ton Italian-flagged vessel cruising off the Egyptian coast, and in a matter of minutes it became the largest hostage situation at sea since the Second World War. The hijackers weren't supposed to act yet. The original plan, pieced together later from interrogations and intelligence reports, called for the team to ride the ship to the Israeli port of Ashdod, disembark with the other tourists, and carry out an attack on shore. But a crew member stumbled into their cabin while they were cleaning their weapons. The operation was blown before it started. So they improvised. They stormed the dining room during lunch, fired rounds into the ceiling, and declared the ship under their control. What followed was 2 days of floating terror. The hijackers separated passengers by nationality, pulling American and British citizens to the upper deck. They made radio demands for the release of 50 Palestinian prisoners held in Israel. The Italian captain, Gerardo de Rosa, tried to keep the situation stable, negotiating small concessions: food, water, communication with shore. Multiple survivors later credited him with preventing a massacre, saying his calm under pressure kept the gunmen from escalating further. But de Rosa couldn't prevent everything. On the afternoon of October 8th, the hijackers wheeled Leon Klinghoffer to the side of the ship. Klinghoffer was 69 years old, a retired appliance manufacturer from New York. He and his wife Marilyn had booked the Mediterranean cruise to celebrate their 36th wedding anniversary. He'd suffered 2 strokes and couldn't walk. He sat in his wheelchair on the deck while a gunman shot him in the forehead and chest, then ordered 2 crew members to push his body and the chair overboard into the sea. Marilyn Klinghoffer didn't learn her husband was dead until after the ship docked. The hijackers told her he'd been taken to the infirmary. Klinghoffer's murder rewired the entire crisis. Before it, this was a hostage situation with potential for negotiated resolution. After it, the Reagan administration wanted blood, or at minimum, justice. The problem was jurisdiction. The ship was Italian, the waters were Egyptian, the hijackers were Palestinian, the victim was American. 4 different legal frameworks overlapped, and none of them produced a clean path to prosecution. Egypt stepped into the vacuum. President Mubarak opened a back channel to the PLO, and within hours, Yasser Arafat's organization brokered a deal. The 4 hijackers would surrender the ship in exchange for safe passage out of Egypt. Abbas himself flew to the Achille Lauro on an Egyptian tugboat to finalize the arrangement. He looked the hijackers in the eye, told them the deal was solid, and walked them off the vessel himself. Washington found out about the deal almost in real time. The National Security Agency had been monitoring Egyptian communications throughout the crisis. Oliver North, then on the National Security Council staff, was tracking every intercept. When the intelligence confirmed that Egypt intended to fly the hijackers out of the country aboard a commercial aircraft, that Mubarak was going to let the men who murdered an American citizen board a plane and disappear, the White House went from frustrated to furious. Mubarak made it worse. He went on television and told reporters the hijackers had already left Egypt. That statement was false. NSA intercepts proved the terrorists were still in the country, waiting at Al Mazrah Air Base outside Cairo for their flight. The president of Egypt had lied to the president of the United States on camera, and the Americans had the signals intelligence to prove it. Reagan's team now faced a question with no precedent in modern military history. Could the United States intercept a foreign nation's civilian aircraft in international airspace and force it to land? Seize the passengers without firing a shot, without killing anyone, without triggering a rupture with Egypt? Legal advisors said it was possible under narrow conditions. North was already on the phone to the Pentagon, and the military planners were saying the window was roughly 6 hours. Rear Admiral David Jeremiah aboard the Saratoga battle group started pulling his air wing commanders into the briefing room. The clock was running. The Situation Room smelled like cold coffee and carpet cleaner. It was late evening in Washington, and the overhead fluorescence gave everyone's skin a grayish cast that made the room feel like a submarine. National Security Advisor Robert McFarland sat at the head of the table. Oliver North stood. He was always standing. North laid it out fast. The EgyptAir 737 hadn't taken off yet. NSA was still tracking communications at Al Mazrah. If the Navy could get fighters airborne from the Saratoga in time, they could intercept the aircraft over the Mediterranean, box it in, and force it to divert to a NATO airfield. North wanted to use NAS Sigonella in Sicily, an American naval air station located on Italian soil. The Italians had primary jurisdiction over the Achille Lauro case anyway. Land the plane there, pull Abbas and the hijackers off, hand them to Italian authorities. Clean. McFarland listened. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, patched in by secure phone, pushed back hard. The risks were staggering. What if the Egyptian pilot refused to comply? What if he tried to land in Tripoli instead, Gaddafi's Libya just across the water? What if the fighters accidentally triggered a mid-air collision with a civilian aircraft full of innocent passengers? And the diplomatic fallout with Egypt could be catastrophic. Mubarak was a critical American ally in the Middle East, the linchpin of the Camp David framework. Forcing down his country's airplane would humiliate him publicly. North had answers for all of it. The Tomcats wouldn't need to fire. Their presence alone, 4 fleet interceptors running dark, appearing on the 737's wingtips at night, would give the Egyptian pilot no real option. You don't argue with an F-14 at 300 feet off your wing. The divert to Sigonella kept everything inside NATO legal structures. And as for Mubarak, North's argument was blunt. The man had already lied to Reagan on international television. The relationship was damaged whether the intercept happened or not. Reagan made the call from his private quarters. McFarland briefed him by phone, walking through the operational concept, the legal framework, the risks. The president asked a handful of questions. Then he authorized the mission. The margin was almost non-existent. From Reagan's authorization to the expected takeoff of the EgyptAir Flight, the planning window was somewhere around 4 hours. The order had to travel from the White House to the Pentagon, to the 6th Fleet, to the Saratoga, to the ready room of Fighter Squadron 103, the Sluggers, who would fly the Intercept. Every link in that chain had to function perfectly, at night with zero rehearsal. Nobody had ever tried to do this before. There was no playbook, no doctrine, no previous after-action report to reference, no established procedures of any kind. The Navy was writing the procedures in real time. Aboard the Saratoga, the Air Wing commander picked up the secure phone. The message was 7 words long. North worked the phones like a man possessed. While the Saratoga's air wing was spinning up, he was back in the Situation Room pulling together the single most critical piece of the puzzle. Which airplane, exactly, was Abbas on? Egypt operated dozens of flights out of Cairo every night. Commercial traffic crisscrossed the Mediterranean on predictable routes to Tunis, Algiers, Tripoli, Athens. The Navy couldn't intercept all of them. They needed a tail number. The NSA had it. Signals intelligence operators at Fort Meade and at listening stations across the Mediterranean had been vacuuming Egyptian military and diplomatic communications for 3 straight days. The intercepts were specific: flight times, departure airfield, aircraft type, even passenger manifests discussed over open channels. Egyptian operational security was poor, critically poor. Communications between Al-Mazah Air Base and the Egyptian Foreign Ministry identified the specific aircraft as an EgyptAir Boeing 737, flight number 2348, scheduled to depart for Tunis with Abbas, the 4 hijackers, and a small number of Egyptian diplomatic escorts aboard. How did the Americans process that intelligence fast enough to act on it? Look at the infrastructure. The NSA's Mediterranean collection architecture in 1985 was built for one purpose: tracking Soviet naval aviation. Massive antenna arrays at sites in Italy, Greece, Turkey, and aboard ships in the 6th Fleet existed to intercept bear and backfire bomber communications as they sortied from bases in Crimea and the Kola Peninsula. The processing pipelines were designed to take raw signals, intercepts, translate them from Russian, analyze them for tactical relevance, and push actionable intelligence to fleet commanders within minutes. The whole system was a Cold War machine tuned to Soviet frequencies and Soviet communication protocols. Repurposing that machine to track Egyptian diplomatic chatter over North Africa took improvisation. The frequencies were different. The language was Arabic, not Russian. The communication patterns didn't match any Soviet template the system was built to recognize. NSA linguists, who normally spent their shifts listening to Soviet submarine commanders, were suddenly parsing conversations between Egyptian air traffic controllers and foreign ministry officials. One former analyst described the shift as like using a telescope designed for deep space to read a license plate across a parking lot. The optics worked. You just had to repoint everything in a hurry. Back to the operation. North had his flight number by mid-evening Washington time. He passed it to the Pentagon, which relayed it to Vice Admiral Frank Kelso, commanding the 6th Fleet, who pushed it to Rear Admiral Jeremiah on the Saratoga. The chain moved fast because North insisted on staying on the line at every handoff, verifying receipt, demanding confirmation. He later described the planning in characteristically unsubtle terms. "We were going to intercept that plane, and we were going to bring those terrorists to justice," he told investigators during the Iran-Contra hearings. The only question was whether we could get the fighters there in time. The mood in the White House needed no further interpretation. This wasn't a deliberative process anymore. Reagan had given the green light. North was the engine driving execution. The legal framework, tenuous as it was under international aviation law, had been sketched out by White House counsel in what amounted to a few hours of frantic work. The justification rested on the argument that the aircraft was carrying fugitives from justice who had committed an act of piracy and murder against a United States citizen. Under those conditions, interception in international airspace could be defended. Barely. North also solved the basing problem. Sigonella made operational sense because it was American-controlled and close to the projected flight path. But the base sat on Italian sovereign territory, which meant Italian cooperation, or at least Italian acquiescence, was required. North reached out to the Italian government through back channels. Prime Minister Bettino Craxi's office was notified. The Italians had their own reasons to want Abbas in custody. An Italian-flagged ship had been hijacked in what amounted to an act of war against their merchant fleet. The interests overlapped enough to move forward. By 11 p.m. Washington time, every piece was in position. The NSA had the flight and the Navy had the fighters. The Italians had been warned, and the legal justification existed on paper. North had threaded intelligence from Fort Meade, through the White House, through the Pentagon, through the 6th Fleet to 4 Tomcat crews sitting in a ready room on a carrier in the middle of the Mediterranean. The EgyptAir 737 was taxiing at Al Mazah. 21:47 hours local time, October 10, 1985. The first F-14A Tomcat of Fighter Squadron 74, the Bedevilers, hit the number 1 catapult on the Saratoga's bow and went from 0 to 160 knots in under 2 seconds. The acceleration slammed the pilot and his radar intercept officer back into their Martin Baker seats with a force of roughly 4 Gs. Then the deck vanished beneath them, and there was nothing but black. No horizon, no moon. The Mediterranean on an overcast October night is a void. Water and sky merge into a single featureless darkness that swallows depth perception whole. Pilots call it flying inside a bag. Your eyes are useless. You trust your instruments or you die. The Tomcat's heads-up display painted altitude, airspeed, and attitude in green phosphor on the windscreen. And that ribbon of light was the only thing separating controlled flight from a dive into the sea. A second Tomcat followed off the catapult within 90 seconds. Then 2 more from VF-103, the Sluggers. 4 aircraft total, each carrying a crew of 2. 8 men launched into total darkness on a mission that had been briefed less than an hour earlier. What did the crews actually know at this point? Not much. The briefing aboard the Saratoga had been fast and incomplete because the situation was still developing. They knew they were looking for an EgyptAir Boeing 737 somewhere over the central Mediterranean, probably on a southwesterly heading toward Tunis. The aircraft was carrying the terrorists responsible for the Achille Lauro hijacking. The mission was to intercept it, box it in, and force it to divert to Sigonella. Beyond that, the picture got thin. Nobody had the aircraft's exact position. Nobody even knew if the 737 had taken off yet. Finding it was the E-2C Hawkeye's job. The Hawkeye, a turboprop carrier aircraft with a 24-foot radar dome bolted to its back, was already airborne, orbiting at around 25,000 feet northwest of the Saratoga's position. Its AN/APS-138 radar could track more than 250 targets simultaneously across a detection envelope stretching nearly 300 miles. On a normal night, the Hawkeye's Combat Information Center crew would be sorting Soviet bomber tracks or managing a fleet air defense picture against simulated cruise missile raids. Tonight, they were scanning every commercial air corridor between Egypt and North Africa, looking for one specific 737 among dozens of radar returns. The Hawkeye's 3 operators sat shoulder to shoulder in the aircraft's fuselage, bathed in the amber glow of their radar screens. Every blip was a potential match, but any one of them could also be an Alitalia flight full of tourists, a Libyan Arab Airlines cargo run, a Tunisian domestic shuttle, or an Egyptian military transport. Misidentify the target and the Navy forces down the wrong airplane, an international incident of a completely different kind. Positive identification was everything. The Tomcats climbed through 10,000 feet and leveled off, holding in a racetrack pattern west of Crete while the Hawkeye worked the picture. Fuel was burning. The fighters had launched with full internal tanks plus 2 external drop tanks each, giving them roughly 2 hours of loiter time before they'd need to either find a tanker or return to the boat. The EgyptAir 737 had departed Al Mazah 4 minutes before the first catapult shot. The Hawkeye found it. A single radar return, bearing 240 from the carrier group, altitude 25,000 feet, speed 420 knots, tracking southwest along the commercial airway, toward Tunis. The return matched the expected departure time from Al-Maza and the projected route, and the radar signature was consistent with a 737. The Combat Information Center controller aboard the Hawkeye keyed his radio and vectored the Tomcats onto an intercept heading. The lead F-14 pushed its throttles forward, and the twin Pratt & Whitney TF-30 engines responded with a deep vibration that climbed through the airframe and settled into the crew's spines. Closure rate was fast. The Tomcat was doing 540 knots to the 737's 420. At that differential, the distance between the two aircraft shrank by roughly 2 miles every minute. The radar intercept officer in the back seat called ranges: 40 miles, 30, 20, 10. The blip on his AWG-9 radar was steady and fat, exactly the kind of return you'd expect from a commercial airliner's fuselage. But a radar return doesn't tell you whose airplane it is. The Tomcat crews had been given one absolute requirement before they left the ready room: visual confirmation of the aircraft's identity before any attempt to force a divert. The 737 had to be positively identified as the EgyptAir Flight carrying Abbas. That meant reading markings on the fuselage. At night, at 25,000 feet, while both aircraft were moving at roughly 450 miles per hour. So, how close do you have to get to read an airline's livery in total darkness? The answer depends on your light source, and at that altitude, there was only one: the Tomcat's own exterior lighting, supplemented by whatever glow came off the 737's cabin windows and navigation strobes. In practice, the pilots needed to close to within 15 to 20 feet of the target aircraft's fuselage, wingtip to wingtip, close enough to see the faces of passengers through the windows if the cabin lights were on. 15 feet of separation between a 62,000-pound fighter and a 110,000-pound airliner, both hurtling through black sky at altitude. One flinch on the stick, one unexpected turbulence pocket, one moment of spatial disorientation, and the result is a fireball visible from 3 countries. The Egyptian pilot had no idea the Tomcats were there. The fighters had approached with their exterior lights off and their radars in passive mode, guided entirely by the Hawkeye's data link. When the lead Tomcat slid into position off the 737's left wing, the crew flicked on their formation lights, just enough illumination to see the other aircraft's skin. The RIO in the back seat pressed his face against the canopy, cold plexiglass against his oxygen mask. The 737's fuselage was right there, enormous, filling the entire right side of his field of vision. The blue stripe was unmistakable. So was the Egyptian flag on the tail and the EgyptAir logo beneath the cockpit windows. Confirmed. Flight 2348, the aircraft carrying Abu Abbas and 4 murderers, was 20 feet away. The lead pilot keyed his radio and reported the identification to the Hawkeye controller, who relayed it back through the chain: Saratoga, 6th Fleet, Pentagon, Situation Room. Within minutes, the White House had confirmation that the Navy was sitting on the right airplane. Now came the part nobody had rehearsed. The Tomcats repositioned into a box formation around the 737, one fighter on each wing, one high, one trailing low. Then the flight leader switched to the international distress frequency, 121.5 megahertz, and transmitted in the clear. He instructed the Egyptian pilot to alter course to Sigonella, Sicily. The Egyptian pilot's response was immediate and predictable. He refused. He declared he was on a sovereign Egyptian government flight operating under diplomatic authority and demanded the fighters withdraw. The Tomcat flight leader repeated the instruction. The Egyptian pilot contacted Cairo. Cairo told him to continue to Tunis. He tried. The lead Tomcat drifted closer, its navigation lights now fully illuminated, close enough that the Egyptian captain could look out his cockpit window and see the outline of AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles hanging from the fighter's weapons pylons. Nobody said a word about the missiles. Nobody had to. The Egyptian pilot looked at those pylons, looked at the darkness beyond them, and began his turn towards Sicily. Naval Air Station Sigonella sits on the eastern coast of Sicily, 8 miles southwest of Catania, wedged between Mount Etna's volcanic slopes and the Mediterranean shoreline. In 1985, it served primarily as a logistics and patrol hub, P-3 Orions flying anti-submarine missions over Soviet submarine transit routes in the central Mediterranean. The base was quiet at night, routine, a place where nothing happened fast. At approximately 11:30 p.m. local time, the tower received a priority message from 6th Fleet Headquarters. An EgyptAir Boeing 737 was inbound under US Navy fighter escort. The aircraft was to be directed to a designated parking area away from the main terminal. Ground security was to prepare for the arrival of hostile personnel aboard the aircraft. The tower controller read the message twice. Delta Force operators were already on the ground. A team from the Joint Special Operations Command had been pre-positioned in the Mediterranean aboard the USS Iwo Jima as part of the original Achille Lauro response. When the Intercept mission went live, a C-141 Starlifter flew them into Sigonella ahead of the 737. They set up a perimeter on the tarmac in full tactical gear. Black fatigues, body armor, MP-5 submachine guns, night vision. Their orders were straightforward. When the 737's doors opened, they would board the aircraft and take the hijackers into U.S. custody. The 737 touched down at 11:45 p.m. Its landing lights cut white streaks across the wet tarmac as the Egyptian pilot brought it to a stop in the designated area. The 4 Tomcats made low passes overhead, their engines shaking the air, before peeling off to orbit the field. On the ground, the Delta operators moved toward the aircraft in a tactical approach formation. Then the Carabinieri showed up. Italian military police, dozens of them, arrived in vehicles from the base's Italian section and formed their own perimeter around the 737. Outside the American perimeter, the Italians had jurisdiction on Italian soil, and they intended to exercise it. The Delta team found itself in a standoff not with the terrorists inside the airplane, but with a NATO allies' armed police force surrounding it. American weapons pointed outward. Italian weapons pointed inward. 2 rings of armed men around a parked airliner, neither willing to move. The tarmac was around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Nobody felt cold. An American officer present later described the scene to reporters. You had Delta pointing guns at Carabinieri, Carabinieri pointing guns at Delta, and 4 terrorists sitting on a plane in the middle wondering what the hell was happening. The standoff lasted hours. Washington wanted Abbas extradited to the United States to face murder charges. Rome wanted to handle it through Italian courts. The Achille Lauro was an Italian-flagged vessel, and Italian law gave them primary jurisdiction. Phone calls burned between the White House and the office of Prime Minister Craxi. Reagan pushed hard. Craxi pushed back harder. The Italians were a sovereign nation, and this was their territory. Full stop. Abbas never entered American custody. The Italians took control of the aircraft, removed the 4 hijackers, and allowed Abbas to board a Yugoslav aircraft to Belgrade. He was gone within hours. The 4 gunmen stood trial in Genoa. Abbas walked free. We did this in 7 hours. That was Rear Admiral Jeremiah's assessment aboard the Saratoga after the 737 was on the ground in Sicily. 7 hours from the first intelligence tip to wheels down at Sigonella. From a cold start, no pre-planned mission, no rehearsal, no target package sitting in a safe somewhere. The United States Navy identified a specific aircraft, found it in the dark over open ocean, confirmed its identity at 15 feet, forced it to divert across international boundaries, and had a special operations team waiting on the tarmac when it landed. No other country on Earth could have done that in 1985. No other country can do it today. The Soviet reaction was muted, which tells you something. Moscow's official statement called the Intercept air piracy and a violation of international norms. But the Soviet military press told a different story in the weeks that followed. A brief analysis in Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, the Soviet Armed Forces daily newspaper, focused almost entirely on the coordination between the carrier battle group, the Hawkeye, the Tomcats, and the ground element at Sigonella. The article's tone was clinical and deliberately respectful. The Soviets understood exactly what they had just watched. An American carrier battle group had converted from peacetime steaming to a precision counterterrorism operation in the middle of the night with zero advance notice. The implications for Soviet naval planning were obvious and uncomfortable. The diplomatic fallout was real. Egypt recalled its ambassador from Washington. President Mubarak called the Intercept an insult to Egyptian sovereignty and a betrayal of a close ally. He wasn't wrong about the sovereignty part. The United States had forced down an aircraft operating under the authority of the Egyptian government in international airspace without permission. The legal arguments on both sides had merit, but Washington's position was blunt. You harbored the men who murdered an American citizen. You put them on a plane. We took the plane. Abbas walking free from Sigonella stung. There's no way around that. The operational triumph of the Intercept was undercut by the jurisdictional loss on the ground. The Reagan administration was furious with the Italians. The Craxi government nearly collapsed over the controversy. Defense Minister Giovanni Spadolini pulled his Republican Party out of the ruling coalition in protest over Abbas's release, triggering a brief government crisis in Rome. The political cost was real on both sides of the Atlantic. But look at the numbers that actually mattered in the long run. The four hijackers, Bassem al-Ashkar, Ahmad Maruf al-Assadi, Youssef Majed al-Mulki, and Ibrahim Fatayr Abdelatif, all went to prison. Italian courts convicted every one of them. Mulki, who had personally shot Leon Klinghoffer and ordered his body thrown overboard, received a 30-year sentence. The PLF as an organization never recovered its operational credibility. Abbas himself became a fugitive, bouncing between Yugoslavia, Libya, and Iraq for the next 18 years until U.S. Special Forces captured him in Baghdad in 2003 during the opening weeks of the Iraq War. He died in American custody the following year. The declassified cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. He was 56. What the Intercept proved went beyond counterterrorism. It demonstrated that a carrier battle group operating in international waters could execute a mission completely outside its designed warfighting envelope. Outside anti-submarine warfare, fleet air defense, strike operations against fixed targets, and succeed. The entire kill chain from intelligence to intercept ran through systems built to fight the Soviet Navy. The Hawkeye was designed to find Soviet bombers. The Tomcat was designed to shoot down Soviet cruise missiles. The secure communications links were designed for nuclear war coordination. Every one of those systems performed flawlessly in a role their designers never anticipated. The Saratoga's crew didn't get a parade. Tomcat pilots went back to flying routine Mediterranean patrol patterns the next morning. 12 hours later, the Hawkeye crew flew another sortie tracking Soviet surface combatants south of Crete, and the carrier battle group resumed its scheduled exercises as if nothing had happened. That file in the Saratoga's operations log for October 10, 1985 runs 11 pages. October 11, 1985, 6:14 a.m., local time, Eastern Mediterranean. The Saratoga's flight deck at dawn was a wall of noise and salt. Steam curled off the catapult tracks in the early light, mixing with the stink of JP-5 jet fuel that had soaked into the non-skid coating over years of carrier operations. The deck crew was already moving aircraft for the morning launch cycle. Yellow shirts directing tractors, blue shirts chalking wheels. The same choreography they'd performed the day before and the day before that. The 11-page operations log from the previous night was already filed. A brown shirt plane captain was wiping hydraulic fluid off the belly of one of the Tomcats that had boxed in the 737 8 hours earlier. He probably didn't know what the jet had done. The aircraft didn't look any different. In New Jersey, the Klinghoffer daughters, Lisa and Ilsa, woke to phone calls from reporters. Their father had been murdered 8 days earlier. Their mother, Marilyn, who had been aboard the Achille Lauro during the entire hijacking, was still in a state of shock that wouldn't fully lift for months. The family had spent the previous week in a fog of grief compounded by watching Abbas negotiate his own safe passage out of Egypt on television. They'd watched the man who ordered their father's murder walk onto an airplane and fly away. Now the reporters were telling them the airplane had been intercepted. The hijackers were in Italian custody. Abbas had slipped through, but 4 men who participated in killing Leon Klinghoffer were going to face a courtroom. Was it enough? Nobody should have to answer that. Their father was shot in his wheelchair on the deck of a cruise ship and pushed into the sea. His body washed ashore near Tartus, Syria, days later. No Intercept, no matter how brilliant, reverses that. No courtroom verdict puts him back at the dinner table. But the Intercept told the Klinghoffers, told every American, something that hadn't been true 72 hours earlier. The United States would come find you. Across oceans, in the dark, at 25,000 feet, through diplomatic barriers, sovereign airspace, and the comfortable assumption that geography equals safety. Robert Oakley, the State Department's counterterrorism coordinator, put it in terms that the intelligence community repeated for years afterward. After October 10th, the calculus changed. People who planned operations against Americans had to factor in the possibility that there was no safe way home. The Saratoga kept steaming east. The Mediterranean was flat and gray that morning, visibility unlimited. Somewhere below the flight deck, in the ready room of Fighter Squadron 74, the mission debrief notes were being typed up on a standard Navy form. Block 14, mission result, contained 2 words, objective accomplished. The stretch of Mediterranean where the intercept happened, roughly 36 degrees north, 14 degrees east, is a busy commercial shipping lane today. Container ships and tankers cross it around the clock on routes between Port Said and Gibraltar. Airline passengers flying between Cairo and Rome pass over it at 37,000 feet, staring at seatback screens, unaware that 4 F-14A Tomcats once boxed in a 737 in that same airspace and changed the way the United States hunts its enemies. The operational template born on October 10, 1985, didn't stay in the Mediterranean. What the Saratoga Battle Group improvised that night, fusing signals intelligence with carrier aviation with special operations forces in real time, across multiple commands, with no pre-existing playbook, became the architecture for American counterterrorism for the next 4 decades. The kill chain that ran from Fort Meade to the White House Situation Room, to a Hawkeye orbiting over open water, to Tomcat cockpits, to Delta operators on a Sicilian tarmac, was, in its essential structure, the same kill chain that would put a Hellfire missile through a car window in Yemen 20 years later. The technology changed. Better satellites, drones replacing some of the manned platforms. But none of that altered the underlying logic. Find, fix, finish, anywhere on Earth, faster than the target can move. That started here. The EgyptAir Boeing 737, registration SU-AYK, continued flying commercial routes for EgyptAir after the incident. It carried passengers between Cairo and Amman, Cairo and Jeddah, Cairo and Tripoli for another 14 years. The airline retired it in 1999. Records on its final disposition are sparse. It was likely scrapped at an Egyptian maintenance facility, its aluminum skin sheared into sheets and sold by weight. The cockpit, where an Egyptian pilot looked out his window and saw Tomcats floating in the darkness, that cockpit doesn't exist anymore. The Achille Lauro itself met a stranger end. The cruise ship caught fire off the coast of Somalia on November 30, 1994, and sank in the Indian Ocean 2 days later. 2 passengers died. The vessel that Leon Klinghoffer was murdered aboard sits in roughly 2,000 meters of water in one of the most remote stretches of ocean on Earth. Italian investigators suspected arson. The case was never conclusively resolved. USS Saratoga, CV-60, completed her final deployment in 1994 and was decommissioned on August 20th of that year at Naval Station Mayport, Florida, after 38 years of service. She spent the next 20 years in the Navy's inactive reserve fleet at Newport, Rhode Island, rusting in the salt air while preservation groups tried and failed to save her as a museum ship. In 2014, the Navy paid a penny, 1 cent, to sell her to Esco Marine in Brownsville, Texas, for scrapping. The dismantling took 2 years. Her 4 catapults, the same ones that threw those Tomcats into the dark on October 10th, were cut apart with acetylene torches and sold as scrap steel. The F-14 Tomcat was retired from US Navy service on September 22, 2006. A handful survive in museums. Several sit at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. One is displayed aboard the USS Midway Museum in San Diego. The rest were shredded, deliberately destroyed to prevent spare parts from reaching Iran, which still operated its own fleet of F-14s purchased before the 1979 revolution. The specific aircraft that flew the Intercept mission have not been publicly identified in declassified records. They could be sitting in a museum, or they could be razor blades. The pilots of Fighter Squadron 74 finished their Mediterranean cruise, rotated home to Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia Beach, and continued their careers. Several made captain, and at least one reached flag rank. Most are retired now, living in Hampton Roads or scattered across the Sun Belt. One of them, his name appears in the squadron's cruise book, but not in any declassified mission document, flies corporate jets out of a regional airport in North Carolina.